The train had been moving for 72 hours straight when Werner Hartmann finally spotted something that made his breath catch in his throat. He was 20 years old, pressed against the window of a passenger car that carried him and 499 other German soldiers deeper into a country they'd been taught to despise. The locomotive slowed as it approached another platform in the endless American landscape, this one in Amarillo, Texas, and standing there on the wooden planks was a figure straight out of the propaganda films they'd been shown back in Berlin. The man wore leather chaps worn smooth by years of use, boots that had walked thousands of miles, and a hat with a brim so wide it cast his entire face in shadow. He was rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers, squinting against the brilliant sun that beat down on the high desert, and Hartmann realized with a jolt that ran through his entire body that this wasn't a costume or an act. This was an actual American cowboy, as real as the metal tracks beneath their train, as undeniable as the war that had brought them here. Hartmann had left Camp Shanks in New York 3 days earlier, and every mile since then had been a journey into cognitive dissonance. He and his fellow prisoners were mostly Afrika Korps veterans, men who had fought under Rommel in the scorching North African campaign. They'd been captured at different points during the Allied advance through Tunisia, at Kasserine Pass, where the Americans had bloodied their noses before learning how to fight properly, at the final collapse in Tunis during the invasion of Sicily, when it became clear that Fortress Europe wasn't so impregnable after all. These were soldiers who had expected to die in the desert sands, and in a strange way they had, just a different desert under a different flag with a very different outcome than any of them could have imagined. The propaganda minister back home had spent years preparing the German people for exactly what would happen if they fell into enemy hands. Joseph Goebbels had painted vivid pictures of American savagery, of a mongrel nation without culture or discipline that would treat captured soldiers like animals. The Americans were soft and decadent, he'd told them, a nation of gangsters and cowboys without honor or tradition. They were a mixed-race society that couldn't possibly understand the superior German culture, and they would exact terrible revenge on any German unlucky enough to become their prisoner. Hartmann and his comrades had believed every word because they'd had no reason not to, because propaganda works best when you have no alternative sources of information, because when you're fighting for your life in the desert, you don't have time to question what your government tells you. The first crack in that carefully constructed narrative had appeared on the transport ships that carried them across the Atlantic. Instead of the starvation rations and brutal treatment they'd anticipated, they received white bread that was soft and fresh, real coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the burnt grain substitute they'd been drinking for months, and 3 hot meals every single day. It was more food than they'd seen since before the war started, more than German soldiers on the front lines were getting, and it wasn't some special treatment or psychological trick. This was standard procedure, the same rations that American soldiers received under the requirements of the Geneva Convention, as if the Americans actually cared about following international law even when dealing with enemies who had spent years trying to kill them. Now the train carried them through Texas, and through the windows they witnessed things that contradicted everything Goebbels had ever said. The farmland stretched in every direction without apparent end, great rolling fields of crops that seemed to go on forever. Herds of cattle dotted the landscape, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of animals, wealth on hooves that belonged to individual ranchers rather than the state. Oil derricks pumped away in steady rhythm, pulling black gold from beneath the earth and converting it into the fuel that powered an entire civilization. The towns they passed featured electric lights burning even in the middle of the day, paved roads that connected every settlement no matter how small, and automobiles everywhere they looked. Not military vehicles or government cars, but private automobiles owned by ordinary citizens, more vehicles in a single Texas town than Hartmann had seen in his entire German city before the war. One of the prisoners, a man who had learned to read and write in a Hitler Youth program that taught him the superiority of German culture, would eventually write to his family back home trying to explain what he was seeing. The Americans have so much of everything that they even share it with their enemies, he would write, and then he would stare at those words for a long time before sealing the envelope, wondering if his family would think he'd lost his mind, or if the censors would even allow such a dangerous observation to pass through. The buses that collected them from the train station drove through the main gates of Camp Hearn, located 30 miles northwest of Houston in the heart of Texas cotton country. The facility had been constructed to hold 4,800 prisoners, and as they rolled past the entrance, Hartman and the others craned their necks expecting to see the machine gun towers and attack dogs and brutal guards that featured so prominently in the propaganda films. Instead, they found themselves looking at what appeared to be a small American town that someone had dropped into the middle of farmland. The barracks were solid structures with electricity and indoor plumbing, luxuries that many of them hadn't enjoyed even in Germany before the war. There were hot showers with water that actually got hot, flush toilets instead of latrines, beds with real mattresses instead of straw pallets, and windows with glass that kept out the weather. The camp commander, an American officer whose uniform was clean and pressed despite the Texas heat, addressed them through a translator who spoke German with a Berlin accent. The rules were straightforward and delivered without theatrics or threats. They would work 8 hours per day at various jobs that needed doing. They would follow the camp regulations like any military facility. They would cause no trouble and receive no trouble in return. In exchange for their labor and cooperation, they would receive 3 substantial meals every day, wages of 80 cents per day paid in camp scrip that could be spent at the canteen, access to recreational facilities, and the right to send and receive mail from home. It sounded too good to be true, and Friedrich Becker, an unteroffizier who had spent 2 years fighting in North Africa before his capture, literally couldn't process what he was hearing. Wages, they were going to pay prisoners of war actual money, the same rate that American privates earned, as if German soldiers who had been shooting at Americans just months ago deserved to be compensated for their work like regular employees. The next morning brought another impossibility when they met their work supervisors and discovered they weren't soldiers at all. They were ranchers and cotton farmers and cattlemen, men in worn denim and leather boots that had seen years of hard use. These were men who needed hands for the harvest because every able-bodied American boy was either in uniform fighting in Italy or preparing for the invasion of France that everyone knew was coming. The American agricultural system was feeding not just its own population, but half the free world, sending food to Britain and the Soviet Union and everywhere else that needed it, and the cotton fields of Texas stretched for thousands of acres waiting to be picked. Without workers, the crops would rot in the fields and the entire supply chain would collapse, so the German prisoners became the answer to every farmer's prayer, skilled labor that could be put to work immediately without the months of training that new recruits required. One rancher named John Davidson surveyed the group of prisoners with the practiced eye of a man who had been evaluating workers his entire life. He needed 40 men for his cotton fields, and he pointed at the biggest and strongest Germans, selecting his crew based on physical capability rather than military rank or political affiliation. Then he did something that stopped the entire proceeding cold and made everyone watching wonder if they'd misunderstood what was happening. Davidson walked directly over to the Germans he'd selected, extended his right hand like he was greeting a neighbor at church, and introduced himself in clear English that the translator carefully converted into German. In Texas, he explained with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world, men shake hands before working together because that's how civilized people conduct business, regardless of what uniforms they might be wearing. Wilhelm Müller, an Obergefreiter who had fought at Kasserine Pass and carried shrapnel scars from that battle, stared at the extended hand like it was some kind of weapon he didn't recognize. 6 months earlier, he'd been shooting at Americans in Tunisia, trying to kill them before they killed him, and now one of them wanted to shake his hand like they were equals entering into a mutual agreement. The contradiction was so profound that for a moment his brain simply refused to process it, but training kicked in, and he reached out and took Davidson's hand. The grip was firm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked with his body every day, not soft or weak or decadent like the propaganda had promised, but strong in the way that only honest labour can create. The cotton fields of Brazos County stretched away to the horizon in neat rows that seemed to converge on infinity, and under the brutal Texas sun, the work was exactly as hard as Hartman had expected. Bent backs that ached by noon, bleeding fingers torn by the sharp bowls, 100-pound sacks that had to be dragged to the collection points, and the endless repetitive motion of reach and pull and stuff that continued from sunrise to sunset. But something extraordinary happened in those fields that no one had anticipated, and that would have been literally impossible back in Germany. The German prisoners worked alongside Mexican migrant workers who had been following the harvests for generations, black sharecroppers who had been farming this land since before the Civil War, and poor white tenant farmers who were barely making ends meet despite working harder than anyone in Berlin could imagine. The racial hierarchy that Nazi ideology preached as fundamental law, the careful stratification of superior and inferior peoples that justified everything the Third Reich had done, all of it crumbled into dust under the Texas sun, where everyone sweated the same, everyone's back ached the same, and everyone drank from the same water bucket when the temperature hit 110 degrees. At noon each day, a woman named Rosa Martinez rang the dinner bell from the ranch house porch, and the prisoners braced themselves for bread and water and maybe some thin soup if they were lucky. Instead, they got beef stew, thick with meat and vegetables, fresh cornbread still warm from the oven, sweet tea cold enough to make their teeth ache, and apple pie for dessert because Rosa believed that working men deserved good food, regardless of where they came from. She didn't speak German, and the prisoners didn't speak Spanish, but she ladled extra portions onto their plates with a smile that needed no translation, because food has always been a universal language that transcends borders and ideologies. Werner Hartmann would remember that meal for the rest of his life, not because the food was good, although it was the best meal he'd eaten since leaving home, but because a Mexican woman who had every reason to hate Germans treated them with the same kindness and dignity she showed everyone else. The Third Reich had told him this was impossible, that inferior races couldn't feel genuine human compassion, that only Germans understood concepts like honour and generosity. The Third Reich had been wrong about that, just like it had been wrong about so many other things. Saturday nights at Camp Herne brought another revelation when the recreation hall filled with music that sounded nothing like the military marches they'd grown up with. Someone had found a radio station playing Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, and the sound of Western swing filled the barracks with rhythms that were uniquely American, a fusion of jazz and country and folk that existed nowhere else on Earth. After Italy switched sides in September of 1943, the Italian prisoners of war gained additional freedoms that made the Germans jealous, including permission to attend local dances under careful supervision and with chaperones watching every move. The German prisoners weren't allowed quite that much liberty, but some camps eventually permitted carefully monitored social events where they could interact with locals under controlled conditions, always supervised and always with strict rules about behaviour, but still representing a slice of normalcy that seemed impossible in the middle of a world war. The prisoners formed their own bands using instruments provided by the camp administration, learning American songs by listening to the radio and practicing until they could play them reasonably well. Some of the more musically talented Germans began writing new compositions, strange hybrid pieces that combined German folk melodies with Western swing rhythms, creating music that existed nowhere else in the world, and that perfectly captured the surreal nature of their situation. They were enemy soldiers being paid to pick cotton while learning to play American music, and somehow this was their reality now, instead of dying in a desert on another continent. The letters home created their own crisis of conscience, because what could they possibly write that would make sense to people who hadn't experienced what they were experiencing? How could they describe any of this to families suffering through Allied bombing raids that turned entire cities into rubble, to mothers standing in ration lines for hours hoping to get a loaf of bread, to wives who hadn't seen real meat in months and were making do with turnips and potatoes and whatever else they could scrounge? Friedrich Becker sat down with pen and paper and tried to compose a letter to his wife in Hamburg that wouldn't sound like complete fantasy. "The Americans are not what we were told," he wrote carefully, knowing the censors would read every word. "They have given us warm clothes and good boots, better than what we had in the Wehrmacht," he continued, skating close to criticism that might get the letter confiscated. "We eat meat every day, and I am saving my wages, so when I come home we will have money to start over," he finished. And then he sat there staring at what he'd written and thinking about everything he couldn't say. He couldn't mention the abundance that surrounded him on every side, the way every farmer seemed to own an automobile, and sometimes two. The electric lights that burned all night because nobody worried about conserving power. The stores in town that were packed with goods that Germans hadn't seen since before the war started. He couldn't describe the casual wealth that Americans displayed without even thinking about it, the way they threw away food that would feed a German family for a week, the way they complained about rationing that was more generous than pre-war German standards. How could he explain any of that to his wife, who was probably wearing the same dress she'd owned for 5 years because there was no fabric to make new ones, who was heating a single room because there was no coal for the furnace, who was raising their children on propaganda and promises while the world burned around her? The censors wouldn't let it through anyway, so he sealed the envelope and handed it to the camp mail clerk and hoped she would understand what he couldn't say. At Camp McLean, near Amarillo, the Cowboys weren't metaphorical concepts or propaganda caricatures, but real working ranchers who needed help managing thousands of head of cattle spread across land so vast it made Germany look like a postage stamp. Thomas Anderson was a third-generation Texas rancher who surveyed his new workers with the kind of skepticism that comes from long experience with hired hands. He had Luftwaffe pilots who'd never touched a shovel, panzer crews who knew tanks but not animals, and U-boat sailors who'd spent months underwater and probably thought cattle were mythical creatures. Not a single one of them had ever been within 100 feet of a cow, and Anderson sighed deeply while calculating how many of them would get kicked or bitten or trampled before they learned what they were doing. This was going to be interesting in the way that getting thrown from a horse is interesting, painful, and educational in equal measure. He started with the absolute basics, because you couldn't assume anything with city boys who thought food came from stores rather than farms. How to approach a horse without spooking it, how to hold a rope properly so you didn't lose fingers when an animal pulled against it, how not to get kicked by putting yourself in the wrong position, how not to get bitten by being stupid around the business end of any creature with teeth, and how not to get trampled by assuming that a 1,000-pound animal cared about your personal safety. The Germans were terrified of the horses and cattle in that special way that people who've never worked with animals are always terrified, and the animals were suspicious of these strange-smelling men who moved wrong and talked in harsh foreign syllables, so it was mutual distrust at first sight from both sides. But Anderson was patient in the way that ranchers have to be patient, because you can't rush nature or animals or the learning process that transforms city folk into cowboys. His own son was flying B-17 bombers over Germany right now, dropping ordnance on cities and factories and probably killing people just like these prisoners used to be. But that was war, and this was work, and Anderson understood the difference. These boys standing in his corral were somebody's sons too, enemy combatants or not, and they were here on his land needing to learn skills that would keep them employed and useful. The cattle didn't care about politics or ideology or which side anyone had fought on, and neither did Anderson, as long as the work got done properly and the animals stayed healthy. Within weeks, something magical happened that surprised everyone, including Anderson, who thought he'd seen everything in 40 years of ranching. The Germans took to cowboy work like they'd been born to it, despite never having seen a horse outside of cavalry units. Maybe it was their military discipline that translated well to the structured routines of ranch work. Maybe it was their engineering minds that appreciated the complex logistics of moving cattle across vast distances. Or maybe it was just that working with animals was honest in a way that war had never been. There were no lies between a man and a horse, no propaganda between a cowboy and a steer, just work that needed doing and results that were immediately visible. Erich Schmidt had been a Hauptmann in the Wehrmacht, an officer who'd commanded men in combat, and now he was learning to rope cattle under the tutelage of a Texas rancher who'd never finished high school. Within 3 months, Schmidt became Anderson's best horseman, able to rope and brand and doctor cattle with skill that matched cowboys who'd been doing it their entire lives. At night, he sketched the landscape in a notebook he'd been given, drawing the mesas at sunset with their layers of red and gold, longhorns standing against the sky in classic Western poses, and cowboys working alongside Germans in images that would have been literally impossible anywhere else in the world in 1943. He was capturing something that existed in this strange liminal space between war and peace, between enemy and ally, between what the world said should be and what actually was. Sunday mornings brought another surprise when the American military allowed German prisoners to hold their own religious services within the camps. Lutheran ministers and Catholic priests who'd been drafted into the Wehrmacht like everyone else led worship services in German, and the American authorities provided hymnals and religious materials and freedom of religion even for enemies who'd been trying to destroy democracy itself just months earlier. Some camps even arranged special permits that allowed prisoners to attend local churches on holidays under escort, treating religion as something that transcended national boundaries and military conflicts. Christmas of 1944 found a handful of German prisoners sitting in the back pews of a small American church while the congregation sang hymns they all knew. When they reached Silent Night, originally Stille Nacht and written by an Austrian priest more than a century earlier, the Germans knew every word in their native language while the Americans sang in English, and somehow it was the same song, the same prayer, the same plea for peace on earth and goodwill toward men. By the third verse, some of the Germans were crying, not from sadness or homesickness, although those feelings were certainly present, but from the profound shock of being treated as human beings with souls and dignity by people who had every right to hate them. They'd been told Americans were godless materialists without spiritual depth, that the melting pot had diluted everything meaningful about culture and tradition, that a mongrel nation couldn't possibly understand concepts like faith or honor or transcendence. But here they were, singing the same hymns and praying to the same God in a church that welcomed them despite the uniforms they'd worn and the things they'd done, and the contradiction was so profound it broke something open inside them that propaganda had sealed shut. December 23rd of 1944 brought a different kind of drama when 25 U-boat sailors at Camp Papago Park in Arizona decided they'd spent enough time as prisoners. They'd been digging a tunnel for 3 months, working in shifts and disposing of dirt in ways that wouldn't attract attention, engineering an escape route that stretched 178 feet beyond the camp fence. Their plan was brilliant in its ambition and stupid in its execution, because they intended to float down the Salt River to Mexico, where they would somehow live free until Germany won the war and came to rescue them. They'd built a collapsible boat from materials scrounged around the camp, studied maps that showed the river system, saved food from their rations, and prepared for everything except the actual conditions they would encounter. Hans Werner Krauss held the rank of Kapitänleutnant and led the escape with the same confidence he'd shown commanding a submarine in the Atlantic. They emerged from the tunnel into the Arizona desert under a full moon that illuminated everything like daytime. And for one glorious moment, they were free men again, soldiers who'd beaten the system and escaped captivity. They ran toward the Salt River with their boat and their supplies and their plans for reaching Mexico. And then they stopped dead because the Salt River was completely dry, just sand and rocks without a single drop of water anywhere in sight. The maps they'd studied so carefully were from 1880, drawn before the dams were built and before irrigation systems diverted every drop of water for agricultural use, and their beautiful collapsible boat was now completely useless weight they'd have to abandon. Their plan died right there in the desert sand, but they were committed now, so they scattered in different directions, hoping that at least some of them might make it to Mexico on foot. Within hours, they were hopelessly lost because the Arizona desert in December is freezing at night and burning during the day, and none of them had grown up in this kind of terrain. They had no water beyond what they'd carried in canteens, no real food except the bread and cheese they'd saved, and no idea where they were going because one stretch of desert looks exactly like every other stretch when you're lost and panicking. Johann Kremer stumbled into a gas station near Phoenix after 3 days of freedom, sunburned and dehydrated and hallucinating from heat exposure. The attendant was an old man named Pete, who took one look at this babbling German and gave him water and made him a sandwich, and then called the authorities like any responsible citizen would do. While they waited for the police to arrive, Pete shared his coffee and talked about his own son who was fighting in the Pacific Theatre, and the two of them sat there in that gas station like it was the most natural thing in the world for an American civilian and an escaped German prisoner to have coffee together. Two fathers whose sons were lost in different ways, one temporarily free in the desert and one permanently lost in a war that seemed like it would never end, and somehow the shared experience of parenthood bridged the gap that ideology had tried to create. Jürgen Wattenberg made it the farthest of any escapee, all the way to downtown Phoenix, where he wandered the streets for more than a month before a street cleaner noticed his accent and got suspicious. The police found him on January 28th, sitting on a bench on Van Buren Street, exhausted and homesick, and actually relieved to be caught because even escaped from captivity, America was still America, abundant and comfortable and impossible to hate no matter how hard you tried. Spring of 1945 brought the end of the war in Europe, and with it a shift in mood throughout the camps as letters from home stopped coming entirely. The Allied bombing campaigns had reduced German cities to rubble, families were scattered or dead, and the entire infrastructure of the country had collapsed into chaos. What was there to go back to except destroyed buildings and occupied zones and starvation conditions that made prison camp look comfortable by comparison? Thomas Anderson made an offer to his German cowboys that he knew couldn't be accepted, but felt he had to make anyway. He wished they could stay and work the ranch permanently, he told them through the translator, although most of them understood English pretty well by now. He would sponsor them if the law allowed it, pay them $100 a month plus room and board, more than they could possibly make in Germany, even if there were jobs available. But the Geneva Convention was absolutely clear about this. Prisoners of war must be repatriated without exception regardless of individual circumstances or preferences, and the law was the law even when it seemed cruel. The cowboys would have to go home, but home to what exactly? Soviet occupation in the east, where the Red Army was raping and pillaging its way through Prussia, British and American occupation in the west, where at least the treatment would be civilized, bombed out cities where nothing worked anymore, a shattered economy with worthless currency, starvation conditions that would last for years, and the collective guilt of a nation that had followed a madman into absolute disaster. Ranchers across Texas and New Mexico and Arizona wrote letters to their congressmen explaining that these weren't just prisoners anymore. They were neighbors and friends and the best workers they'd ever employed. Couldn't some exception be made? Some special visa program? Some way to let them stay in America where they'd proven themselves to be decent, hard-working men? But the law was clear and the policy was firm, and there would be no exceptions, no matter how many letters arrived in Washington explaining the situation. May 8th of 1945 was Victory in Europe Day, when Germany finally surrendered unconditionally and the war on that continent officially ended. In Camp Herne, the prisoners gathered around radios to listen to the news in silence, processing the reality that their country had ceased to exist as an independent nation. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had made it to 12, and everything they'd fought for had turned to ash and scattered in the wind. But something else had been born during their captivity, something unexpected and profound that would outlast the Reich and the war and all the propaganda that had brought them here. Understanding had grown in these camps and on these ranches and in these churches, a recognition that enemies were just people you hadn't worked beside yet, that hatred couldn't survive a harvest season, that humanity was stronger than any uniform or flag or political ideology. That night, John Davidson brought a bottle of good bourbon to Camp Herne, pre-war stock that he'd been saving for a special occasion, and he shared it with Wilhelm Müller and the Germans who'd worked his cotton fields for 2 years. They drank to the end of the war, to the dead on all sides who'd paid the ultimate price for decisions made by politicians and generals, and to whatever future might come next, now that the killing had finally stopped. Müller told him, no longer needing the translator because his English was fluent and carried a Texas drawl that made people smile, that he wanted to come back to America when he could, if he could, whenever the laws changed enough to allow it. America had shown him something that Germany never had and never could, the revolutionary concept that strength doesn't require cruelty, that power doesn't demand hatred, that enemies can become friends over cotton fields and cattle drives if you just treat people like human beings instead of propaganda categories. The repatriation began in 1946, with trains reversing the journey they'd made years earlier, carrying prisoners east to the ports where ships waited to take them back to Europe. Back to a destroyed nation divided among the victorious powers, back to cities that were piles of rubble, back to families that might not exist anymore, back to a future that looked bleak and hopeless compared to the lives they'd been living in Texas. But the Germans carried something with them that was more valuable than any physical possessions, knowledge that would help rebuild their shattered country. Not military secrets or tactical information, but something more practical and powerful, an understanding of how Americans farmed and organized and worked. They'd seen American abundance firsthand and understood it wasn't magic or natural resources or lucky geography. It was methods and machinery and management techniques that could be learned and copied and adapted to German conditions. More importantly, they knew Americans now, not the propaganda caricatures that Goebbels had painted, but real flesh and blood people. Thomas Anderson teaching them to ride horses with patience and humour, Rosa Martinez ladling extra stew onto their plates with genuine kindness, John Davidson shaking their hands like equals before a day's work, Pete giving water to an escaped prisoner, because that's what decent people do, regardless of uniforms or flags. When they told these stories back in Germany, nobody believed them, because the stories contradicted everything they'd been taught about America and Americans. The idea that prisoners of war had been treated better than German soldiers were treated by their own military seemed like obvious fantasy, and paying them actual wages for their labour seemed like communist propaganda rather than capitalist reality, and teaching them valuable skills that they could use after the war seemed too generous to be true. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable once you started looking at the numbers. 425,000 German prisoners of war had worked on American farms between 1943 and 1946, harvesting millions of dollars worth of crops that would have rotted in the fields without their labour. They picked cotton by the ton, thousands and thousands of pounds that clothed Allied soldiers and civilians, and they saved entire harvests that would have been lost if farmers had been forced to rely solely on the depleted domestic labour force. The American agricultural miracle that fed the Allied war effort and prevented starvation in liberated Europe had been made possible in part by German prisoners who worked the fields and ranches with the same discipline they'd brought to military service. By 1950, something remarkable happened when American immigration laws changed to allow former prisoners to return as legal immigrants if they met certain criteria and could find sponsors. Former prisoners pooled their savings and boarded ships in Hamburg and Bremen, not as prisoners this time, but as immigrants seeking the America they'd discovered during captivity. One former Africa Corps sergeant who'd picked cotton in Brazos County arrived at the train station in Texas in 1951 to find John Davidson waiting for him with the same handshake and stronger grip. No translator was needed anymore because his English was perfect and carried that distinctive Texas accent that made him sound like he'd been born there, and within months he was working the cotton fields again, except now he got paid American wages and could build a life. He married a local girl whose father had been skeptical at first, but who came around when he saw how hard the German worked, and eventually they opened a machine shop that fixed tractors and farm equipment for ranchers throughout the county. His son would go to Texas A&M to study agricultural engineering, and his grandson would serve in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division of the United States Army, completing a transformation that would have been unimaginable 30 years earlier. Another former prisoner returned to Arizona, where Thomas Anderson had work waiting for the best horseman he'd ever trained, regardless of where the man had been born. Eventually, this German immigrant bought his own ranch, 500 acres of beautiful land near Tucson, where he raised quarter horses that won prizes at state fairs throughout the Southwest. His neighbors all knew his story because he didn't hide his past, and they didn't care because in Arizona you're judged by how you work and how you treat people, rather than which side you fought on in a war that ended decades ago. Even one of the Papago Park escapees eventually returned legally to the United States and opened a small business in Phoenix, not far from where he'd been recaptured after his ill-fated escape attempt. The irony of a German who'd once tried to flee America, now choosing to live there permanently, wasn't lost on anyone. But it perfectly illustrated how much everything had changed. Decades later, when most of them were old men approaching the end of their lives, groups of former prisoners of war organized reunions and returned to visit the camps where they'd spent the war years. They brought photo albums filled with pictures of young men in Wehrmacht uniforms learning to pick cotton and rope cattle and live alongside their enemies, visual evidence of a transformation that seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. At one reunion held in Texas, an elderly rancher stood to speak, his voice weaker than it had been when he was shouting instructions across a cotton field 50 years earlier, but his message clear and strong. "You boys came here as enemies," he told the assembled Germans and Americans, "but you left as friends, and you came back as family, and that's the American way and the cowboy way, and ultimately the human way of dealing with conflict and difference." The applause went on for 5 minutes while former enemies embraced, and not a single eye in that room stayed dry. The numbers tell one version of this story: 425,000 German prisoners of war held in 700 camps scattered across 46 states, millions of dollars in agricultural labor that kept the American economy functioning during wartime, and roughly 5,000 who eventually returned as legal immigrants to build lives in the country that had once been their enemy. But the real story isn't contained in statistics or economic data or demographic trends. It lives in the transformations that occurred one person at a time. Nazi soldiers became Texas cowboys, enemies became neighbors, hatred dissolved like sugar in sweet tea when exposed to simple human kindness and daily interaction. Propaganda shattered when it collided with reality because lies can't survive prolonged contact with truth. And the truth was that Americans were neither the monsters nor the weaklings that Goebbels had painted them to be. The Germans had expected American barbarism based on years of propaganda about mongrel races and decadent democracy, but instead they found American abundance that went far beyond material wealth. Yes, there was plenty of food and goods and resources, but more importantly, there was abundance of spirit, the confidence of a nation so secure in its strength that it could afford to be generous even to enemies. America was strong enough to show mercy, powerful enough to treat prisoners with dignity, wealthy enough to pay wages to men who'd been shooting at American soldiers months earlier. This wasn't weakness or softness or lack of resolve. It was the opposite. It was strength so complete it didn't need to prove itself through cruelty or domination or petty revenge. In his final letter from Camp McLean, one prisoner tried to explain this to his mother, who'd probably never leave Germany in her entire life. "The Americans are cowboys, just like Goebbels said," he wrote carefully. "But what Goebbels never told us was that cowboys could be kind. He never told us they would share their food without being forced to, teach us skills we could use after the war without worrying we might become competitors, treat us with the same humanity they showed their own people. He never told us they would shake our hands like equals before a day's work, talk to us like human beings instead of animals, share their churches and their music and their way of life with men who'd been trying to kill them. He never told us the truth about anything, because the truth would have destroyed the entire ideology he spent his life building. The truth was simpler and more profound than any propaganda could capture. In the American West, where land stretched further than European minds could easily comprehend, German prisoners of war discovered something that transcended nationality and ideology and the entire structure of war itself. They discovered that enemies are just strangers you haven't worked beside yet, that hatred can't survive the shared experience of bringing in a harvest together, that humanity is stronger than any uniform or political party or national boundary that humans invent. They came to America as warriors of the Third Reich, convinced of their superiority and the righteousness of their cause, and they left as cowboys and farmers and ranch hands who'd learned the most dangerous lesson possible for any totalitarian ideology. They learned that their enemies were human beings with families and hopes and dreams just like themselves, and in learning that they became human again too, after years of being treated as cogs in a military machine. The transformation happened slowly, one day at a time, across thousands of days, one handshake and one shared meal, and one moment of kindness, building on all the others until the accumulated weight of human decency crushed the propaganda structure that had been built to support hatred. In the dust of Texas cotton fields, where German and Mexican and black and white workers labored side by side, in the mesa shadows of New Mexico, where cowboys and former soldiers learned to work together, in the desert sun of Arizona, where even escaped prisoners received kindness from strangers, something new was born. A recognition that nationality matters less than character, that ideology matters less than how you treat people, that in the end we're all just human beings trying to make our way through a difficult world, and maybe that shared humanity is stronger than all the things that try to divide us. They came as soldiers and prisoners and enemies. They left as friends and neighbours and sometimes family. And in that transformation they proved that even in the middle of the worst war humanity had ever seen, there was still room for grace and redemption and the possibility that tomorrow might be better than yesterday.